Over the past few years in Boston, we've had a growing population and growing concern about the cost of housing. Mayor Walsh has tried to ease the housing problem, mainly by creating more supply. If there's still plenty of concern about displacement, a report from the city shows there's some promising signs of relief. To tell us about the report is our guest from the city's Department of Neighborhood Development, the Director of Operations, Devin Quirk. Thank you very much for being with us, Devin.
Glad to be back, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Most of us, we just can't fail to notice all the tall buildings that I'm sure they have rents and acquisition prices out of this world. But what about regular housing for regular people? How are we doing?
Right. That's exactly why Mayor Walsh, when he took office, asked us to write a comprehensive housing strategy for the city. So he convened a group of housing leaders and community members and said, let's look forward to housing to 2030. What are our goals? What do we need to accomplish? What do we need to do now? And that plan is primarily first a plan for growth. We know that people want to live here, people want to work here, people want to stay here. So we know to accommodate for that growth, we have to build 53,000 units of housing by 2030. That's a big part of the plan, but that's not the most important part of the plan, because the most important part of the plan is that it's a plan for affordability. So Mayor Walsh, what he cares most about is that no matter who you are, what your income is, what your background is, you deserve to be able to call Boston home, and we want to make sure we have a housing strategy that gets us there. So 2 years in, we're actually seeing some results that the strategies that we've been working on are actually paying off. We're seeing record numbers of affordable new units being built. Over 2,500 new units are in the pipeline. And also importantly, we're seeing results that the market rate development that's happening, all those cranes in the sky and the new buildings going up, that's actually having a benefit for the rest of us. The market for housing that existed before that building boom started, those rents in existing stock, those rents are actually starting to moderate or in some cases go down.
Talk about the older housing, because the kind of scarier things that I've been hearing, whether it's East Boston, Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapian, people are saying, people who want to live in that housing, the kind of people who've been living there for the past few decades, it's just out of their reach.
Yeah, so one of the things we're most concerned about is displacement. How do we prevent displacement? Certainly, affordable housing is a big part of that strategy, and the more that we can create affordable housing units, the better off we'll be. But we also have to work with the market. And we're seeing that supply and demand actually does work in Boston, and it is working for the low-income, middle-income, moderate-income families that Mayor Walsh cares most about. If you take a look at what was newly constructed in Boston over the past few years, if you only look at what was the new construction rents, those are up 18% over the previous year. So anything newly built, those rents go up and up and up. That's great for developers. They'll probably keep building. But for the rest of us, if you look at what was here before 2011, those rents are moderating and actually slightly going down. A 4% decrease for new listings is important because it shows that supply and demand does work for the rest of us in Boston.
Now, I know that's an average figure, and I know you're talking about a place that might have been recently vacated, maybe fixed up as well, so that price isn't going to be as high as it used to be. But what's it like for the person who's lived someplace for a long time, and their rent has lagged? Maybe they're only paying $1,000 a month.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's important for everyone to know when we're doing analysis of Boston's rents, we're looking at what the new listings are in the market. So it's just, if you're leaving your apartment and going out to look at what's available, if you're looking at that older stock, those rents are moderating. But certainly if you're staying in an apartment, you've lived in an apartment for a while, your rent isn't necessarily going down, it's probably staying the same. Many landlords increase their rent every year. So that's going to continue to happen. So it's a both-and strategy. So there's the strategy of what we can do to create market housing at more moderate rents. That's supply and demand. There's the strategy of what we can do to create more affordable units where the rent is stable and doesn't go up and is capped on your income. And we're actually, like I mentioned, building record numbers of that under Mayor Walsh's leadership, both through our subsidy programs, what we do, the money that the city puts in to create affordable housing, but also through our value capture. We want to make sure that as private development happens in the city, that we're capturing as much value from that new housing as possible. 13% of all the new units built in any neighborhood in the city have to be affordable housing. If you're building offsite, it has to be 18%. And if you're building in one of our new strategic growth zones, whether that's Washington Street in Jamaica Plain or Dorchester Avenue in South Boston, over 20% of that new housing has to be income restricted affordable. So the lived experience is different based on where you are and what housing situation you're in. But the mayor's housing strategy definitely has different approaches for each group to make sure that you can find a more affordable place.
What's taking shape right now, too, is that we're seeing these new clusters of potential transit-oriented housing.
Yeah.
It could be near Savin Hill in Dorchester, near Reedville. Is there anything that's sort of systematically looking at all that, make sure you get the most benefit from that?
Absolutely. So that's, I mean, the systematic approach is, we started with Mayor Walsh's housing plan, which is a plan for affordability in Boston, how much housing we need. Then the city comprehensively has embarked on the Imagine Boston 2030 process, which has engaged tens of thousands of residents across Boston's neighborhoods to say, where do you want housing built? What do you want that to look like? What affordability level should we be targeting? And that has helped us prioritize where that new housing should go, what our policy should be. Like I mentioned, we want to make sure that as new growth happens, we're capturing as much value as possible. We don't want to stop new growth from happening because the growth in market rate housing, like I mentioned, is also contributing to allowing older housing stock rents to moderate or go down. So it's a tough balancing act. We want to capture the most possible, ensure that the greatest affordability for the lowest income individuals, but also encourage growth because growth actually does help prevent displacement.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Devin Quirk from the Department of Neighborhood Development. Another issue that we're seeing come up more, especially as you get away from downtown with some of these new units, Charlestown, for example, pushback because they're worried about traffic.
Yeah.
Even Reedville, people were concerned about that. So what do you do? Because, I mean, the cars do back up out there.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess I have the benefit of being a housing-focused person. So as I go to a community meeting, I think about, well, what can we do to make sure the housing is most affordable in this neighborhood for the greatest number of people and for those in the greatest need. Certainly that has to be balanced against all the other infrastructure issues, parking, traffic, transportation, schools, et cetera. But I think that's what the Imagine Boston 2030 plan is for, to figure out where the right places for us to grow are. They're often not in the core of existing neighborhoods, but on sort of outlying areas that have been underutilized in the past, so that the addition of density doesn't impact the existing neighbors as much. But also I think it's really important for people to keep in mind the benefits of growth. Of course, growth, like I keep mentioning, allows for new housing supply to be added and moderate rents in existing stock. New growth also allows us to capture as much value as possible to create that new housing. The Inclusionary Development Fund, since its inception, has collected about $90 million. That's money that we're putting back into creating affordable housing in those neighborhoods and other places. And then also something to keep in mind is that as we grow, that's also new property tax revenue for the city. So if you just look at what was built last year, that's over $75 million worth of new property tax revenue for the city. That's new money for our schools, that's new money for our parks, and really importantly to me, it's new money for our affordable housing programs. Mayor Walsh has invested in the city's first line item for senior housing. We're putting that money into use to create new senior housing opportunities. He's also invested in the largest affordable housing funding rounds in the city's history as well.
What's also interesting here is, I guess, the trend in the map of new housing units. Shortly after the mayor took office, a lot of that was still downtown, but it seems to be moving.
Yeah, so certainly there is growth downtown. You see the cranes in the sky, and everyone sees that. But there is several identified in the Imagine Boston 2030 plan areas for growth that are outside the downtown core. So places like Sullivan Square in Charlestown, Orient Heights in East Boston, Newmarket, even Hyde Park, Reedville area is an area where we think we can fit some new density in that the community will support that. So we're looking comprehensively, looking for feedback on where the right places to grow are.
So finally, how does this stack up with the goal for the year 2030? What was it? Was it 53,000?
53,000 units by 2030. We are well on track for that. Over 12,000 units have been built already. We've got another 7,000 in the pipeline right now. And we've got another 20,000 that are planned. We kind of know where they might go, but they're not actually in the permitting process yet. So that takes us all the way up to about 40,000 units that we know how we'll get to them by 2030. So we're right on track, and in fact, in some areas ahead of schedule.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Glad to be back, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Devin Quirk from the Department of Neighborhood Development. In a moment, the revolution heads to the Democratic State Convention.